Folks, we are a humble folk, modest, and we don't tend to embrace things until they have been supported overseas. So being able to hear the praise that we are getting from these global voices, I think, is incredibly important to us. And I hope one day that the Flight of the Conchords, Lord, and Peter Jackson can be joined by the Synthetic Substances Act as something that we all look up to. And we will know that that act has really made an impact when the Australians claim it for their own. Let's start with something that you can send if you're watching this live at home on the live stream. Please do tweet your questions, hashtag Pathway to Reform. Amanda Feilding, it is an absolute privilege to be in the same room with your good self. Can you just tell us, how did you get Archbishop Desmond Tutu, 10 former heads of state, 11 Nobel Prize winners, Noam Chomsky and Yoko Ono, all to sign your amazing letter condemning the war on drugs? How did you do that?
Just kind of asking them.
The argument was already won in their minds?
Well, I think many more people now realize that it simply doesn't work, prohibition. So they're very happy to lend their names to this. And I have to say that President Molina was the first sitting president. So
right.
I was very delighted when he did. And then President Santos said he would too, but only if he was put first. Anyway, very good.
Dr. Ethan Nadelmann, what is really driving the reform in America? Is it compassion replacing the punitive, or is it just the economics? I mean, does the moralistic rhetoric, does that dissipate when the state needs to pay bills?
It really depends upon the issue. On the issue of cannabis reform, I mean, part of it is the opportunity to get revenue. And so, for example, with the marijuana reform initiatives in Colorado and Washington, we actually have in there that the revenue will be dedicated, in the case of Colorado, for school construction, and in other places I think it's drug treatment or what have you. And that notion that wouldn't it be good for the state to get this money rather than having the gangsters get it is definitely part of it. But it's also, as I said, the notion that they prefer, when you survey people, what you find is the people on the fence, that issue is one about revenue. The second one is preferring that the police would focus on real crime. And then, of course, it happens in a context where, it's been true for 30 years or whatever, or more, that roughly half of all 17 or 18-year-olds have used marijuana. But this is the first generation where half of their parents have used marijuana. So it's led to a different type of discussion. We've had 3 occupants of the White House in a row who have now used it. I mean, the first one said he didn't inhale. The second one, when admitted, he had to get outed by an old friend. But the third one, when asked if he was inhaled, said, wasn't that the point? And many times. I mean, that's Barack Obama's, contribution to this. When it comes to the bigger issue of reducing mass incarceration, some of that's being driven fiscally, because building new prisons was the '1 fastest growing item in state budgets in the 90s. So there's that element. Part of it is the transformation in consciousness among African American leadership, who back in the 80s were so flipped out by the whole crack cocaine spread that they endorsed these incredibly draconian laws, and then began to realize that none of those laws had reduced the availability of crack cocaine in poor neighborhoods, but they'd done a lot to ship huge numbers of young black men to out-of-the-way prisons. So that variable, the fact that some of our Christian leaders, and even traditional ones, former President George Bush typified this, began to talk about the fact that we had 750,000 people coming out of prisons each year that had to re-enter society and become productive, and that we needed to deal with that. And the conversation about how to help people who had been in prison re-enter society and become productive is now beginning to move towards not just looking at what we call the back end of coming out of prison, but reducing the flow in. So those are arguments, I think, that have all. The fact that our policies have exacted such devastation in Mexico and elsewhere, that doesn't play much in America.
Right. Yeah. Fiona Patten, I would vote for you. Often.
Thank you.
Why has the political spectrum in Australia been so slow in genuine progression progressive reform on drugs?
Yeah, it's really disappointing, and I mean, there's lots of conspiracy theories on that, which is around the alcohol industry, which of course is ginormous in Australia, and that has had an impact on it. And I know, I mean, Ethan was there, well, over a decade ago, and we were moving to decriminalisation of marijuana, and we, in fact, in ACT South Australia, we did decriminalise marijuana, and we allowed the personal growth of it. We've now reneged on those legislation, and we're going back to a more draconian. When I speak to members of Parliament, which I do very regularly, they are all saying, yes, of course, Fiona, you're absolutely right. The laws are stupid, and they'll reel through the arguments, and then they'll go, but it takes a very brave person. And they do that kind of yes minister, you know, very brave minister kind of a thing. And they fear, they hold their seats by 4%. They fear that if they do something like this, then 4% of the population may oppose them, and they may not get elected, and they may not get a superannuation check, and they may not get driven to the airport and travel in business class.
Right. And those are very terribly important.
They are obviously, yes. Health, well-being.
so do you think it would require quite a lot of political courage now in Australia for anyone to change?
Look, I think it's happening, and I know Dr. Alex Wodak here in the audience has said it is just a matter of time, and it's a matter of time internationally as well. It may be that these laws, I mean, certainly the laws in New Zealand will have a great impact. Yes, and if we can adopt them as our own, that will also be very positive. But I think we've also, as I say, 30 laws in 3 years, and none of them have worked, and none of them have stopped these products from being sold. All they've stopped is the regulation of them. So I think there is, you know, they are starting to scratch their heads and think, possibly is there another way to go? And I hope, I have some faith in some small states like the ACT that we may see that.
Dr. Brian Emerson, how much political pressure is exerted over the Canadian government by the United States when it comes to drug reform in Canada?
Well, having sat in a session many years ago, it was actually incredible. But things have changed. The situation was Canada was poised to bring in a cannabis decriminalization bill, and they were also setting up the supervised injection site in Vancouver. And I was invited to a session at the U.S. consulate, where the deputy drug czar came and basically lectured the provincial politicians for probably an hour on what was going to happen if Canada went this route. Now, that was huge pressure. However, I think things are starting to change. I think now the U.S. federal government doesn't have that same stance in regards to cannabis, so I would expect that we wouldn't start to see that pressure. I mean, it was a big deterrent years ago, but I think things are starting to shift. In fact, the challenge right now from the Canadian federal government perspective is to really open their eyes to what's happening in the U.S. and look at some of the approaches to cannabis. So currently it's very interesting to see we're heading into a federal election in a couple of years, and the opposition party headed by Justin Trudeau, who's the son of former Prime Minister Trudeau, one of his early planks that he's come out with is regulate the cannabis market. And as you said, it takes a very brave politician. However, all that the reaction to that has been is good on you. And in fact, I think that the momentum that's starting to be generated has got the current federal government a bit antsy. And so now they're starting to talk about, well, maybe we should shift cannabis laws and decriminalize cannabis and make it a ticketable offense.
Right.
So it's very interesting to see this dynamic. Now, there's certainly a lot of concern in the drug policy reform community about shifting to a ticketable offense, because I think, as was shown in Australia, you get this net widening where suddenly the police are writing all kinds of tickets, and you're bringing in a whole bunch more people under the enforcement realm. So very fluid situation in Canada in the next couple of years.
I think what Brian said about the U.S. is right. The U.S. ambassador in Uruguay very clearly said that the U.S. government now regards this as an internal matter. Right. And what I've heard from people who have spoken at the highest levels in the White House and what have you, is that essentially there's an understanding that what the federal government and the Justice Department have said to Washington and Colorado, which is if you can do this right and you can move towards a regulatory approach and we don't see any jumps in marijuana accidents on the roads or adolescent misuse or organized crime or other things like that, then we're okay with that. That same message also applies now to foreign governments. And so the effective message essentially is, as I understand it, to foreign governments, if you want to, that the U.S. government, the federal government, the Obama administration, has essentially put marijuana reform on the other side of the drug war firewall. And is saying to foreign governments, if you can do this in a way which does not result in an increase in exports, say, of illegal marijuana to the U.S., and so long it doesn't result in any other types of increasing public security problems, and so long as you assure us you're not talking about legalizing cocaine and heroin and those sorts of things, then we can live with it. And I say the second point I want to say about Brian's point is that right now you have this disastrous government in Ottawa, the Harper administration, which is like a throwback to the drug wars of the 1980s and 90s in the US. I mean, you actually have a Canadian prime minister pushing through the Canadian Parliament laws that even conservative Republicans are now repudiating and reforming. So the notion that you could have a society that we Americans once regarded as civilized over the border, and that it's going to be locked in, and that a reform like you guys are now doing in New Zealand is set, and relax, and then you see what happens with something like that. I mean, it's just a warning that there's nothing inevitable about these positive trends. If there's any silver lining, it's that the absurdity of that position by the Harper administration in Canada, or by some of our drug warriors, or by the drug czar in the US, almost seems to undermine respect for the government's position and lead to an acceleration of reformist sentiment, which I think is what happened with marijuana reform in the US and in Canada.
Right. Let's open it up to people on the floor. Do we have our microphone person?
Thank you. Look, I'd just like to ask perhaps Nathan and even Fiona about the International Narcotics Control Board. The implications, of course, of the legalisation of cannabis in the United States is in contravention, as I understand, of the 61 Convention that classifies cannabis as a narcotic. Just a small background is, which is why Fiona might like to comment, because we came very close in the late 90s to having a heroin trial in the ACT. And those lovely men in dark suits from the International Narcotics Board paid a visit and effectively twisted the arm, put some pressure on the Australian government to scuttle the trial on the basis that we had a Tasmanian poppy industry that was legally producing narcotics. So, look, the context is that they have had incredible power, as you say, prosecuting the war on drugs over the years, the internationally led war on drugs. What's the implications of the Narcotics Board? Will they be going to Colorado to sample the goods and to look at the environment over there? And what's the implications internationally?
Well, that's right. I mean, Australia had been progressive and has been progressive in drug policy, and certainly some of the first needle exchanges were born in Australia, and we did take a very pragmatic view to that. And our health minister back in the day, Neil Blewett, he was travelling down that path of cannabis legalisation, and then our very progressive, conservative chief minister suggested a heroin trial in the ACT. It would have been a very closed, very regulated model, and our even more conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, squashed it with that. I think we are listening less to America, I'm afraid, at that level. You know, even though, but they're apologising to us now, which is really nice. You know, I really thank you for that, Ethan. I thought that was very kind of you, and we accept it gratefully. But yeah, I think we are listening less to the United States. I mean, I hope we're following Colorado and Washington and looking at what they're doing, but we are listening less.
Yeah, and with respect to your question about, for those of you who don't know, the INCB is the International Narcotics Control Board. It is the United Nations has a UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNODC. They have a Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which meets annually and just met last week in Vienna. And then they have the INCB, the International Narcotic Control Board, which is about a dozen people appointed by respective governments, and they see themselves as the guardians of the International Convention, the very conservative, and what we would call in the US judicial terms, strict constructionist interpreters of the convention. Like sort of like an old conservative, it's like what the old, Ministry of Propaganda was in the Soviet Union, or in the more evil days of the Catholic Church, what their special bodies were. This is the equivalent in the UN drug control system. And so what's happened is that organization has no real power, right? It issues, it tells the government you're doing something wrong. But what the governments have done, so it's a shame that you Australians chickened out on the heroin maintenance, because you could have led the world in the early 90s, you'd done the research, you were set to go, and then you bailed. And at that point, the Swiss said, okay, we'll do it. And then the Dutch and the Danes and everybody else. And when the INCB sent those governments letters saying you're in contravention of the international conventions, the Swiss and the Dutch and the Germans wrote back and said, well, you have your lawyers and we have ours. And according to our interpretation of the international conventions, what we're doing is fine. Then when the INCB was opposed to supervised injection facilities, such as you have in Australia or in Vancouver or in about 60 cities around the world, I mean, what they really did is reveal their true colors, that they were not about looking at the drug control conventions in terms of health and safety, that they were about strict interpretation for moralistic reasons, and that I think they more or less delegitimized themselves. When Uruguay came along and legalized cannabis in December, the head of the INCB, a Belgian named Raymond Jans, insulted Uruguay, at which point the Uruguayan president told him to take a walk, and if he dared, why doesn't he show his face in Uruguay? As far as I can tell, the Justice Department hasn't said peep about these international conventions, right? God bless them. When it comes to what do we do at the international drug conventions, there's really three tracks in play, and these three can proceed in tandem with one another. The dominant track right now is to say, you have your interpretation, we have ours, and therefore we're going to move forward and basically to ignore them. The second, actually there's four tracks. The second track is the one that Bolivia did last year, a few years ago, where the convention said criminalize coca leaf, and when you looked at the evidence that had been used for the criminalization of coca leaf, it didn't meet any sort of scientific standards. It was grounded in bigotry against, darker-skinned Indios back half a century ago. And so the Bolivians withdrew from the convention and then re-signed, but this time making an exception for the offensive provision. That's the second model. The third model is to work for reform of the conventions, most especially by removing cannabis and coca leaf from the convention, because the science is in there to keep them there. And the fourth track is to do the groundwork for a reformation of the entire convention, to ultimately moving towards a new 21st century global drug control convention that is more similar to the WHO tobacco control convention. There's one that shies away from prohibitionist institutions and relies overwhelmingly on public health approaches. So I'd say for New Zealand, I don't know if the INCB has weighed in. I know that when the New Zealand delegate presented this model here in Vienna last year, people were kind of didn't know, when Uruguay does its thing, or Bolivia does its thing on coca, there's an outrage from some of the more conservative members. When New Zealand presented it last March, it was like, really? That sounds interesting. Really? It was like they weren't almost prepared for this type of breakthrough. So I think the fact is that what New Zealand's doing in this area is actually providing a potential model for what the new mid-21st century global drug control convention might look like.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we did a report saying what you'd have to change in the UN conventions to permit countries to decriminalize or to regulate. And so all the tracks one would have to change. And I think it's time that countries of the world, like in Latin America, decide that they've had enough of being told by America, basically, what they can and can't do. And I think that's become very much their feeling. They're fed up with America, basically. And they realize that they can do what they like, and is America going to go and bomb them? They try to threaten economically. They did that to Guatemala. They've done it to Uruguay. actually their bark is much worse than their bite now.
You need to have oil first before they really respond.
Yeah, I think it's changing, and I think the New Zealand model helps that. So it's all breaking it down now.
Our next question.
Okay, so we've got some social media questions here.
Go for it.
All right, so we've got one from Otago Normal, and it's a question for the whole panel. Are New Zealand cannabis law reform advocates better off pushing medical only or for full legalisation? Has the time come?
Sorry.
Well, I would, first I want to look at the public opinion polling on this thing. I mean, I sometimes think that if you think that you're not going to be able to legalize cannabis more broadly in the short term, then there's something of a moral obligation to at least push forward on the medical marijuana if in fact that can go through fairly quickly. I mean, when we got behind the medical marijuana stuff back in the mid-90s, it was always for two reasons. The first was that the most pernicious aspect of the war on marijuana was the persecution and prosecution of people who really used marijuana for medicinal purposes, and that they had a right to go first in terms of a right of access to this in legal access. The second reason was the hope that it would transform the broader dialogue around marijuana and ultimately lead to what we saw happen in Colorado and Washington. So I think, but if in fact the public opinion polls show that you have a majority of people in favor of legally regulating and taxing marijuana here, and if you see that the people who feel strongly in favor are greater than the people who feel strongly against, I would say you can always introduce both bills with different parliamentarians leading them, but try to push forward on the broader legalization of marijuana and aim for a system like what the Dutch have medical marijuana. Almost anybody can buy it basically in the coffee shops, but for the limited number of people who need marijuana produced under strict sanitary conditions, no mold, all that sort of stuff, they can get it provided from a government source, and in fact national health insurance actually covers the cost of it. But I would say it really depends upon what the polling is and where the parliament is on this.
My comment would be that creating a creating a medical marijuana system is a huge undertaking. At least certainly it has been in the Canadian situation, and it means you're kind of turning yourself into knots to try to create a system which is really important for those who need it for medical purposes. But I think the question would be, and I don't know the legislative and political climate in New Zealand, is where is the effort best placed in terms of creating an interim solution that is going to not meet the needs of the broader society, or looking at a more comprehensive approach. I think the fact that New Zealand has already broken some ground with regards to a regulated market for these new psychoactive substances would create some potential synergies in terms of building on that. So, you'd have to kind of weigh those options about how much effort and cost do you want to do to create a medical marijuana system, when in fact you may have to undo that and redo a whole new system to create a legalized system.
I think that the regulation of cannabis has now become, in the United Nations, it's become an accepted fact. The leading drug policy analysts there said that they are not going to regulate methamphetamine or cocaine or heroin, but strangely, cannabis was left off it. I feel we've tipped the top of the mountain on cannabis, and one should go for full regulation of use rather than this kind of halfway house thing. And after all, cannabis is a much better, it's been tested for millennia, so actually it's probably much safer than these new synthetic cannabinoids. So I think people should go for that. Sure. Yep.
Well, what do they say? In for a penny, in for a pound. But I think they're two separate issues, very much so as well. And when we look at a model in Australia, we would be looking at Canada to be our dealer for medicinal marijuana, as it were. But looking at countries that have already established those frameworks to develop that very specific product that is medicinal marijuana, in Australia, the Country Women's Association, which is, you know, they're the ones that make the scones and keep the history of how to make, you know, pickles and things. They support medicinal marijuana. So we have a majority of people supporting that. But I see that quite differently to regulating the sale of cannabis, and I do think, as Ethan says, it's two separate things, and we should be going for both. The time has come.
More social media questions? Questions from the floor? Where's our microphone person? Right here.
G'day, my name's Nick. I work alongside Fiona in Australia. As Fiona mentioned before, we've had a whole bunch of new laws coming through in Australia, which are additions to the prohibition that we've already got, and they haven't been without victims. I've had a lot of phone calls over the past few months from people ringing up. These are retailers, small family businesses, and consumers as well, who are getting the brunt end of essentially police that consider themselves white knights, saving these people from themselves, you know. And my question is, there's these kinds of people, there's people out there, everyone knows somebody that has this prohibitionist mentality, and it's very hard to reason with these people. It's a moral standpoint, and it's something that when you present evidence, it's like it just goes straight through, and all they hear is, you've got possession of the demon drugs in you or something like that. How can we start a conversation with these people, and these are the people, at least we need to start changing some of those minds. How can we broach the topic with them and make them start to understand things from a different point of view?
Are they law enforcement you're talking about?
Well, law enforcement was my first sort of example, but I mean, that's just, they've got the power to be able to put people in jail or charge people, but everyone's got friends, family members, colleagues that hold the similar position. How do you start to change that?
How do we get the creationists out of the evolution debate? How do we do that?
Well, actually, Nick and I, over a Friday afternoon smoke, quite often discuss this at great length. So we'll continue that conversation at that time. You know, when you talk about the New Zealand model, now, it's not about, you know, making everything free and easy, man. It's about a crackdown. You know, you went from 3,000 outlets down to just a couple of hundred. So I think that's quite often the message, that you're not talking about, you know, we're not talking about sex, drugs and rock and roll like I'd like to, but you're talking about cracking down, regulating and controlling, and I think those are words that prohibitionists like to hear.
You know, I think it depends upon the drug. I mean, with marijuana, because of the high level of familiarity, I saw the survey here, half of all adults in New Zealand have tried marijuana at least once, and I think 1 in 6 use it with some regularity. So with marijuana, it's an issue around familiarity. And the familiarity leading to a greater sense of comfort, and we know what we're talking about, and a societal dialogue where, you know, adults in their 40s and 50s, if they know their teenagers going to a party, they are intelligent enough to worry a lot more about alcohol than about marijuana, and that permeates the discussion. And it's a bit mystifying to me that in Australia and New Zealand, where you have levels of marijuana use that are, I think, close to or as high as in the US, that there's not a more lively and vigorous dialogue, a more bringing this out of the closet. I think what was interesting in the case of the heroin maintenance thing, which I know is not really an issue here, was a drug that was very much the ultimate demon drug in some respects, right? And there it was just, you know, I think as Fiona was saying, or as you were hinting, was that it was a more pragmatic thing, which is that locking up all the junkies and drug dealers is not accomplishing what we want. Therefore, let's start something as an experiment. And the notion that they could start it as an experiment, right, and then test it and do it. And the fact also, I mean, the other element in this is that you had, what happened in Europe in the early 1990s was you had the local drug czars in 4 or 5 cities around Europe, each of whom were committed, were politically skilled. It was the good fortune of having local leadership in the right place at the right time, and of them getting along with one another and starting a European cities on drug policy and putting forward these ideas. And so leadership is an absolutely central dimension of this thing. I would say the hardest part for us is that even as we make progress in reducing, getting rid of mandatory minimum sentences and reducing incarceration, challenging the popular myths around what people believe about amphetamine, methamphetamine, about heroin, about cocaine. I mean, these are all potentially very dangerous drugs. But how many, do you call the kids, the drugs you give your kids, do you call them Ritalin and Adderall here? Is that the same name here? I mean, as I understand it, if you were to break up those Ritalin or Adderall tablets and smoke or inject it, it would be more or less indistinguishable from methamphetamine that's all demonized. And conversely, if you were to take that methamphetamine and produce it in a sanitary environment and sell it in a pill form, it would be quite similar to the Adderall and Ritalin that we're giving our kids. But somehow one's the demon drug and the other one's something that maybe we're giving to too many kids, right? I mean, that and how one breaks through that, there's a very good book called High Price by Carl Hart, a neuroscientist at Columbia University who's trying to challenge this thinking. But I have to say, even as we build support for changing drug policy, breaking through the myths about drugs and what they're about is even a harder one.
I think I would add, excuse me, I would add that sometimes talking about learning the lessons from alcohol and tobacco can be helpful. Because once people start to understand that we're not talking about moving drugs into an alcohol and tobacco framework, which we know are hugely harmful in terms of the way they're currently regulated, but we're talking about moving not only illegal drugs into a more regulated framework, but potentially using that as a way to how do we better regulate alcohol and tobacco. Sometimes that broadens the discussion. So then you're not talking about this illegal, legal paradigm split. You're talking about these substances. And then it also opens the discussion about prescription drugs. And we know how, I don't know what the situation in New Zealand, but in Canada and the US, prescription opioids have been a huge problem in terms of mortality. You know, people are dying. Right. So anyway, I think broadening the discussion from this artificial split between legal and illegal and how do we deal with all drugs helps to, you know, as happens when you get people sort of locked in on one perspective. Broadening the pie of discussion sometimes helps.
I think a strictly regulated market just has the potential to lure the harms. Like in the UK, young people can only get skunk, which is very, very high THC, no CBD, not a particularly nice drug. You have to be, you know, rather sophisticated to be able to find better stuff which is imported from the Himalayas or something, but normal buyers can't get to that. Whereas if we had a regulated market with labelled product, it'd be much easier. And I think that would work through all the different categories of drugs, that basically it would become safer if it was regulated as opposed to illegal.
Next question, where's our microphone? Right over here.
Thank you. A quick comment and then a short question. The comment is, Ethan mentioned that the Commission for Narcotic Drugs has been taking place in Vienna and it's about to wind up, or has just wound up. And I recommend everybody here, if you haven't done so already, please read the speeches of the New Zealand delegate, I regret to say the Australian delegate, and also the speech made by Nora Volkoff, the director of the National Institute for Drug Abuse, at a high-level sub-meeting that was going on just before this started. The New Zealand delegate spoke about this area and used some of the figures that we saw quoted today by the police friend, and said that this has been a very clear success, this Psychoactive Substances Bill. The Australian delegate, I regret to say, said that we've done a lot of work on psychoactive substances and legal approaches, and we're very happy to share our experience with other countries. So if you want to know how to make things even worse, you can contact the Australian government. But Nora Volkoff's speech is really quite remarkable in the grudging acknowledgement that the times are changing. The question I have is addressed to Amanda Feilding, and that is that the usual way most of us practice is that we reward good behaviour and we punish bad behaviour, and we don't do very much of the former, but we really do enjoy doing a lot of the latter. Now we've got two standout leaders, President Mujica in Uruguay and Prime Minister John Key in New Zealand. When is the international drug law reform community, like the Beckley Foundation, maybe like Drug Policy Alliance, Ethan, going to reward good behaviour and start organising that these two leaders and their colleagues get some indication from this international network of drug law reform people who really recognise these historic and very courageous decisions that they've made, which are no doubt not only for the great benefit of the people of those two countries, but internationally. Are we going to have an annual award, for example, or some kind of indication that we recognise that reform is important, takes some courage, and is to be rewarded and applauded?
Well, I absolutely think it's an excellent idea to have a reward. I've been trying to get together groups of particularly Latin American presidents who are wanting to reform, to be chaired by Jimmy Carter, and for it to become a public, I was planning this thing at Tikal, the monument in Guatemala, and so you'd have it as a publicity thing that these brave people are deciding that they've had enough of the bad decisions of the last 50 years, and although they don't agree on the details with each other, they all want to do slightly different areas, they agree on the basic theme that they want to be free to do what they think is best for their countries. And I feel that a reward for people who are brave enough, as you suggest, to go down that path would be a very good way forward.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, for Drug Policy Alliance, we do our biennial conference, and as Alex knows, we actually do give out awards. And so at various points, foreign leaders have been recognized. A few of you have been at these DPA, the International Drug Policy Reform Conference, and the last one, we had a plenary session. We had the Chief of Staff of the Uruguayan President, we had the Foreign Minister of Guatemala, we had the Czech Drug Czar, we had a representative of the New Zealand Drug Policy Foundation, and we had the Portuguese Drug Czar who pioneered that policy. So, but I'll tell you, Alex, I think that for some of these guys, it's nice to get an award from the fellow reformers. Yeah, thank you very much, and they'll come and they'll be honored by it. But what they really need, they need different types of things. I mean, Amanda and I have been speaking with many of them, both the former presidents, current presidents. Speak to Santos, and what he needs is help trying to build up support within his own country for the policies that he's gone out on a limb in terms of defending. I'd say for Otto Perez Molina in Guatemala, something similar. I said for Mujica, they needed help on how to do a public education campaign, and we sent somebody down there to live for the whole year to help them organize that sort of thing. So I think what they're really looking from us as reformers is to keep building support for the innovations that they've gone out on a limb in terms of supporting.
Just on a related comment, I noted that The Economist magazine wrote an article suggesting that President of Uruguay be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I think that would probably go a long ways if The Economist would write an article about the New Zealand experience and what the government is leading. So I think there's various types of recognition, and that type of international recognition is something that can also go a long ways.
Ladies and gentlemen, we need to wrap for afternoon tea. Thank you so much for the panel. Please give you a round of applause.